sure it's recording. After it dropped, it was having problems with the battery. Just set it up there. I'm ready, short, and member. Are you ready? I'm ready. Who would have thought that a man who married his teenage cousin and had a gambling and drinking addiction as well would be known as one of the world's greatest poets? Nevermore, nevermore. Maybe you recognize these infamous words written by Edgar from his renowned poem, The Raven. Edgar Allan Poe was perhaps one of the most widely read and influential writers in America's narrative history. He has been considered one of the first true crime writers of his time period. Many scholars have studied Edgar's life and found it was filled with unfortunate tragedies that began in his childhood and lurked close behind him in adulthood. He used his raw emotion from these life experiences to write poems, short stories, and tales that intrigued the public in the 1800s. During this time, the public had an appetite for murder, mystery, and his sensationalizing of the mind of the psychopathic murderers. Join me today as we take a trip back in time to the 1800s to learn more about Edgar's early years, some of his greatest literary contributions, and his mysterious demise. On to the year of 1809, when the great writer first made his way into this world. Edgar's early years were the beginning of an unpredictable lifetime of both tragedy and success. He was born on January 19, 1809, in Boston, Massachusetts. He was the son of actors Elizabeth, Arnold Hopkins, and David Poe. He had a sister and brother as well. A dispute between his parents led to the abandonment of Elizabeth and the children. She began performing in Norfolk, Virginia. However, tuberculosis had proven stronger than her, and performing to support her children was no longer possible. Edgar's mom passed in December of 1811, when he was only 2 years old. Thankfully, he was taken in by Francis and John Allan. They were a wealthy merchant couple from Richmond, Virginia. He took the family's last name Allan, even though he was not legally adopted. After relocating to England with his new family, Edgar began attending a boarding school in 1816. After a short period, John Allan was forced to move his family back to Richmond, Virginia after an unsuccessful business. He then enrolled Edgar in a traditional school where he quickly outshined many of his fellow classmates, not only athletically but also academically. This didn't make him very popular amongst his fellow students because they looked down upon him. As author Hayes explains, Poe's insecurity about his upbringing combined with his romantic inclinations prompted him to invent elaborate fictions about his life, and much of this came out in his work. He went on to attend University of Virginia, where he impressed many professors with his passion for literature. John had hardly supported him in the way he needed to in order for Edgar to attend full-time or even pay for books for the classes he was taking. So Edgar began gambling with fellow classmates. He had incurred a large gambling debt, as Hayes points out, around $2,000 according to contemporary estimates. After incurring this large amount of debt and not paying good to it, Edgar withdrew from the university and moved back to Richmond with John. Shortly after arriving there, he moved back to Boston, which was his birthplace. Now, with much of his education ending, Edgar began to write as a means for financial stability. At the age 18, he met a publisher who had began a printing business and agreed to publish Edgar's work, but without his name, so there was no income and no notoriety coming from those works that were published. He briefly enlisted in the Army, quickly discharged. He then moved to Baltimore, which is what we know him for here, is when he came to Baltimore and began writing on a new collection of poetry. This didn't sell very well, although he'd given many copies away. He had seen that he needed to change his writing style, and when Edgar made this decision, it marked a very important turn in his success as a writer. His first story, Berenice, The plot revolved around gravediggers who dug up the deceased, took their teeth, and gave them to dentists. He began to see that writing about violence and investigating the psychology behind them appealed to the public. Some of Edgar's other works included Mystery of Marie Roget, The Murders in the Rue Morgue, The Fall in the House Usher, The Pit in the Pendulum, The Telltale Heart, and The Mask of the Red Death. Edgar had a progressing problem with alcohol that became apparent not just with coworkers but also with the public. The insanity that it brought out in him came out in his work when he investigated the mad people and their mental state when they committed these crimes he wrote about. Given his personal tragedies and struggles, paired with his unique writing style, Edgar's death has always had a mysterious aura surrounding it, as we will see next. The death of Edgar Allan Poe on October 7, 1849, has remained mysterious. The circumstances leading up to it are uncertain, and the cause is still disputed by many scholars. Poe was taken to Washington College Hospital on the afternoon of October 3rd and did not regain consciousness until the next morning. For those past few days, he went from delirium to unconscious and back and forth. He never recovered well enough to tell how he had arrived in such a condition. In the early morning hours of October 7th, Poe calmly breathed a simple prayer, "Lord, help my poor soul," and then he passed. His cause of death was ascribed to congestion in the brain. No autopsy was performed at the time, and the author was buried 2 days later. There were several theories that had been formulated as to the cause of Edgar's death. They ranged anywhere from his death was caused due to his frequent intoxication, all the way to he had contracted rabies. Diabetes, heart conditions, toxic syndrome, and many other theories had been presented as the cause of Edgar's death. And dying under such mysterious circumstances, the father of the detective story has left us with a real-life mystery which many scholars, medical professionals, and others have been trying to solve for over the last 150 years. Upon listening to the speech, I hope that you have learned a few things about the eccentric author and the man that was Edgar Allan Poe. He had flaws, as most of us do. However, now that you can see where some of his insecurities and dark images come from. Misfortune seemed to follow Edgar from birth into his early life and throughout his writing career, ultimately also in his death. He gave the readers of his work some of the best murder mysteries ever written, and took with him the secret of his death to his grave. Nevermore, nevermore.